The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Wait, Tylor, I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't.
You're listening to Through the Glass Columns, and it is I, your DJ, Greg Cass, spinning the hits as somebody who knows nothing about the Wheel of Time. Joining me, as always, the big bad wolf himself. It's Tylor Orm. Tylor, how's it going?
I don't know if you intentionally got your hair like greased up in the front for this or what is going on. We're a non-visual podcast, Greg. Things are going very well here. I think you can tell that we are both in a good mood. I am going to attribute this to the fact that we read Perrin chapters, even though it is much more likely that it's the end of the semester and we're both feeling like we're almost done. We had two chapters this week that I really felt like were both slow chapters, and I had no problem reading them and feeling like I had a really good time. Was that your impression as well? Are you feeling the slow? Are you feeling the character and world building? Where did you walk away from this week's reading?
Well, it is a good question, and I will again reveal to our readers. The last episode we'd had a long gap before, so we actually squished these together. It's only been a few days since we last recorded, as such things work, and so it felt like I got my oh my God, what's going on in the Two Rivers fix last week, and then we had the cliffhanger. That was interesting, but I would say not like sticking in my mind as I desperately need to know which Aes Sedai are here. And so then I think because I'd already had those itches scratched, it was like I felt the slow, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
And that's okay. I think it's the kind of slow where, it's like the middle act of a movie where you're like, we just got to get through a bunch of stuff and it'll be worth it if the third act is great. But it sometimes gets a little draggy. I just saw a movie that I loved this movie. I won't say what it is because I don't want to hurt other people's appreciation for it. And it was exactly that. I'm like, I love this so much. And then it got to the middle. I'm like, what is happening? But then the third act was so good. I was like, totally worth it. Like everything is alive and amazing. So I'm hoping that next week might be like here we go. This really was worth kind of all this plot laying as we went on. My question in return for you is, I think you have confessed just once or twice how much you love Perrin. So, I imagine that you have some affinity for these chapters, but is your love of Perrin making these more exciting, or do you find that he's just kind of a vessel for exposition here?
I think the more that I am reading this really carefully, right? The more I'm taking like a fine-tooth comb to these chapters as opposed to just kind of like I'm reading for enjoyment, the more I'm finding that I think what it is I think that Perrin is among the most dynamic narrators in the series. He is the one who, when I'm in his head, I'm excited to hear about how he's analyzing things because there's like a degree of wolfiness that I'm trying to pick up on. I find that he has really interesting and dynamic relationships of all of the characters. We've talked a lot about the I like you and you like me and we're going to be off screen for 5 months, but the relationship will develop. That's not Perrin. He and Fael are kind of always in the same place, as are him and Gaul, and all of the kind of major relationships that he's building. And so I think a lot of it for me is that I actually don't think Perrin has the best plots. In fact, I'd be willing to hazard that of all the major characters, Perrin might have the worst plots. But for some reason, I don't know. I like listening to Perrin think through things. I think he's just a little bit more clear and direct in his internal narration, and that makes me not dislike even the slower things that he goes through in many cases.
I like that answer a lot. I only got a little distracted because in internet language, there's the old joke that I watch blank for the plot, and then it's like the backsides of all the attractive people. So you're going on and on about parents' plots. I was like, yeah, he does have nice plots. And I think I will say everything you just mentioned for reasons you like Perrin, I think makes me feel even more that he's almost suspended in these two chapters, right? That like I personally didn't see a ton of kind of how Wolfie, what's Wolfie, like that seems to kind of be set to the side, and you know, like you just said, the relationships aren't really changing, which means they're not really present or worth commenting on so much. They're kind of flat. Although, you know, that is a little uncharitable to some of the dynamics, at least I took notes on, between Perrin and Fail. There's a little more intrigue to that.
I want to use this then as a transition into our summary and discussion of the first chapter, because I don't want to say too much more. I think you are exactly right about Perrin taking a back seat. And I think the reason I really like these chapters, despite what I joked about at the beginning of the episode, is because they're pretty good Verin chapters. Which I guess, you know, you read the first couple words of the next chapter. So chapter 31, assurances. Yvonne gives permission for everyone to enter, and then both of the warders kind of vanish into the brush, and the Aiel are clearly very impressed by warder stealth. Perrin wonders at the Aiel's relationship to the Aes Sedai, and as they continue into the old sick house, he marvels at just how beat up and kind of broken down it is. The first Aes Sedai that he notices is Verin, and then he also sees Alanna. He doesn't know her very well. He only remembers having encountered her once, but he does recall that Egwene had warned him about her being too interested in Rand, Mat, and Perrin. Verin seems to approve of everything that Meryn Elvir has done to bring them here, and also seems very excited to talk to Loyal. Perrin demands that the Aes Sedai answer why they are here, even despite the fact that Alanna is trying to ask about Rand and Mat and a variety of other things. Both Fail and Meryn seem very upset at how kind of willing Perrin is to disagree with and push the Aes Sedai rather than just going along with what they're saying. Verin explains that they are there to find women who can channel. She gives her theories about how channeling has kind of been culled out of a large number of other areas, but since the Two Rivers is more isolated, there are more channelers there. We also learn when Perrin continues to push them about why they are not fighting the White Cloaks, Alanna says that the Three Oaths are restricting them, and Alanna lost one of her warders named Owain, which is interesting if you're a television show viewer, but she cannot use the power as a weapon, even in vengeance for her lost warder. They say that they've tried to kill Shadowspawn, but channeling draws fades, and so they've been hesitant to do too much. At this point, Alanna heals Perrin, more or less without his permission, although at one point she does muse on why the boys were allowed to leave without being constrained, and even says that if she had her ability, if she kind of wanted to, she could bond them. I'm sorry, I was looking for that word. And then Perrin kind of pulls away immediately, and she says she has not so far gone yet that she would bond someone without permission. Suddenly, Tam and Abel, that is Rand and Mat's fathers, arrive. They have clearly been hunting and have brought rabbits for the group. They ask for after their sons, and Perrin gives them kind of vague, happy answers, mostly about women. Verin warns Perrin with a look that they shouldn't tell Tam that Rand is the Dragon Reborn or that he can channel. And then Perrin takes the men outside, and Fail immediately kind of stands up to go, and Perrin kind of shakes her off, and she actually listens, which causes him to be really surprised and think maybe she was injured more than he thought. At this point, they take the men kind of take Perrin outside. They tease him about his beard a little bit, and then about Fail, and then they give him some advice. And Perrin realizes that all of the advice that the women gave Fail about men is exactly the same as the advice that the men are giving Perrin about Fail. At this point, Tam tries to tell him about his family having passed. He lets him know that he already knows. And then at this point, they see and kill a raven, and they describe how a number of animals have been killed, causing Perrin to realize that Slayer is working both in the waking world as well as Teleron Riode. They said that it will be very difficult to get the prisoners out after Perrin asks. They describe the White Cloak camps, and they also describe a number of farms burned and why everyone seems to be going along with the White Cloaks out of fear over the Trollocs. Perrin says he plans to rescue the girls and then make the Two Rivers a killing ground for the Trollocs. And at this point, both Tam and Abel seem worried for him and warn him about the anger that he seems to be keeping inside. At this point, we jump to Dane Bornhald's POV. He leaves his men after a Trolloc ambush, another one, and he notices that they are only happening when he is specifically on the patrol. He notices that the Trollocs appear to be getting ready to leave, and he tells one of his seconds that they cannot go north. If they are going to travel, they must go south. And then he makes it clear to his second that they cannot enforce this violently, or they can at least send the message violently, and this seems to upset his second. He then gets news from someone that Ordieth returned, reporting a Trolloc skirmish that only killed 2 White Cloaks, and they were the 2 White Cloaks that Dane Bornhald had sent to look after Ordieth. Dane Bornhald is clearly upset, and he sends someone to go get Ordieth immediately. Ordieth fairly quickly arrives after Dane thinks that he is obsessed with the 2 rivers, and so is Ordieth. Ordieth then begins to explain what is happening, and Dane Bornhald slaps him. Ordieth then basically starts ranting about how they need to destroy it all, and all 3 of the boys, Rand, Mat, and Perrin, will arrive, and he seems to think the more violent they are, the faster Rand will arrive. This doesn't seem to do anything to Dane until Ordieth specifically mentions Perrin, and this seems to get Dane kind of more interested and at least willing to continue going along with it. Then Dane thinks that Ordieth is mad, but if he promises results, it may be worth it. We then jump into Padden Fane's head, who is, of course, Ordieth. He thinks that Bornhald is just a tool that he can use. He is actually the one who killed Perrin's family in his anger over being told that he wasn't powerful enough. And then he thinks about his priorities. First, getting Althor, and then going to the tower for what they had taken from him, and then he will have all of the power he needs. He says that he has survived since the Trolloc War, as he is talking to himself, and that he has turned, and it's clear as he's walking through his area of the camp that he has turned some of the White Cloaks to his side. And then he goes into his tent where he has a merge rail tied up, and he gets it to agree to a proposal that clearly makes it quite nervous. That was an enormous amount of summary for a chapter that I'm not sure how much we're going to have to say about it. Greg, say one of the 3 things so I can take a drink of water.
I mean, I think where I go on these chapters is always like, well, why did we need all this at once instead of separate chapters? And, usually the answer is pretty clearly that kind of what's going on here. We have one big chapter that really needs to advance and just some little kind of bits that need showing. And so, I think that opens up an interesting question of why did we need those insights into the White Cloaks before whatever comes, and maybe we can only answer that later. But it's interesting as well. I liked all 3 pieces. It was funny to me. I guess we'll take them in order. So my first kind of main takeaway on this discussion is it was nice to see Verin, and it was nice to see Alanna. I've already forgotten Alanna. And interesting that, they are here and their reasoning. I will say, just to be completely honest, when they gave the story about like, we're just here to find girls, I was like, that doesn't seem accurate. And then, of course, I remembered the 3 oaths, and it has to be accurate, or it has to be the majority of the truth, even if it's not the full truth.
I agree with that, but I want to be very careful, right? At the end of book 2, we had Moraine and Verin contradicting one another, which suggests that one of the 2 of them either can lie or found some workaround to the 3 oaths. And we also are aware that members of the Black Aja can lie, and we've gotten some pretty skeptical views of Alanna so far from multiple people, which raises some big red flags for me about how much we can trust even the words coming out of both of these Aes Sedai's mouth. But continue. I think you're on the right track with everything else.
Well, and in that as well, it was notable to me that the first reaction to Alanna, that
Yeah.
it feels like Robert Jordan. Oh my God, I don't know where my head is at. I just had to look at the cover of the book. I'm like, what's this guy's name again? 100 episodes in, I'm like, yeah, that guy. Um, so Robert Jordan doesn't always lay the clues out so clearly, but to
Mm,
have the immediate reaction of Perrin be, Moraine said not to trust her, essentially,
yeah.
right? Like, it's like, oh, that stood out to me. That's like, there's got to be a reason why we're bringing that up so strongly and clearly that fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I know we're not huge fans of Crossing the Stream, but I think it is worth noting that Alanna is a character that our TV show viewers will be intimately familiar with, that those of us who are only reading the books know more or less nothing about. I think at this point, she has given a lesson to Egwene and Nynaeve. She was at the meeting with the Merlin seat in the second book, but didn't really do much there. And that's about it for this character, right? If you're a book reader wondering where do I know this name from, the answer is a couple of quick name drops in that typical Robert Jordan say the name a few times so you know it'll be important later kind of way. This does, I think, lead me to one of the more interesting moments in this chapter. However, if we're going to talk about Alanna, the new character who has just arrived, we learn a couple of really interesting things about her in this chapter, right? First off, I think you're right. Both Moraine and Egwene seem to potentially have issues with Alanna, particularly her interest in the boys. Second, the way that Perrin kind of observes her staring at him throughout the entirety of this conversation is very unnerving in light of that. And then obviously the two moments that really stand out to me is one, Alanna revealing that she lost her warder, and two, Alanna musing that she would have bonded either Rand or one of the other boys, even though she is not yet so far gone as bonding them without their permission. And it's very clear he tries to pull away when she says this, and she holds him in place, right? This is a woman who I think is both in a really rough emotional place, likely having lost her warder, and also is clearly in some way obsessed in one way or another with Perrin, and especially it seems like Rand. This is all to say it's a really fascinating stew of a character we're getting thrown into already at a full boil. What's your take on this new character as she shows up here?
Well, this is probably my TV show showing, but I immediately thought of kind of greens as the spicy ones, and it's like, some of those moves where it's like, oh, I'd like to bond you. I'm like, well, what is this? Like, I think it is more the kind of political control thing, but it could also be like, handsome, strapping lad. Let's pull him in and so on. So I hear he has nice plots, just word on the street. So I think that's where my head was at. I wasn't necessarily thinking nefarious,
Yeah.
but that particular turn of phrase is interesting, right?
Yeah.
The I'm not so far gone yet.
Yeah.
And I don't take that to mean Black Aja. I do take that to mean that she's moved outside of her comfort zone, that
Yeah.
there are questionable actions being taken that have stretched her credulity, and now she's not so sure whether her moral compass is exactly accurate at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly right. And if we're talking about characters whose moral compasses are unclear, boy, is turning the page to Verin a really good place to be.
Mm.
And I just want to say, if you think Perrin has good plots, Verin has good plots. I cannot lie. That's the joke that I've been waiting to make ever since you said that. I think that Verin gets two really interesting moments in this chapter. One is Verin kind of non-verbally telling Perrin not to reveal anything about Rand to his father, I thought was really interesting. Verin, if anything, has been the character most willing to just say the things that need saying, it seems like, so far this series. And so for her to now be playing the secret game was really interesting. The other was just a moment that kind of made me spit out my water as I was reading it, was when Verin was trying to get Perrin to kind of stop and take her point, and she was very pointed about it. And then Fail jumps in and says something like, "I'm sorry, Moraine has such an easy manner. She hasn't been stopping him from interrupting Aes Sedai." And I think Verin is described as like her eyeballs almost bug out of her face. And I'm like, I'm with you. Describing Moraine as having an easy manner does not make sense to anyone. I thought this was a fun chapter just to see Verin react to things, even if she doesn't have a ton to do. It feels like Alanna got a lot of the heavy lifting expositionally. I just love that character because she's a puzzle box from my perspective. Where are you at with Verin? Were you excited to have her back, or is she kind of just the blank canvas Aes Sedai at this point?
No, I was definitely excited to see her back. I would say where I land on her is I always think of her as knowing more than both she lets on and more than the other characters think
Yeah.
she does. And because she's a little bit ahead of, in particular, Moraine and the Amerlin seat, that makes her really interesting.
Mhm.
And so I'm certainly not going to say I expected her to be the one to come, but as soon as it was revealed, I was like, oh, of course, because among the cast of Aes Sedai who are of interest, she ranks highest. And
Yeah.
and I think the television show tipped off that Alana is more important, so it did make sense for her as well. But Verin in particular, I continue to be interested in to see what she's doing and if she's actually on the level, as you say. I think you've made me more suspicious of her than I might have been if I was reading this purely on my own. Just to be honest, that it doesn't always stand out as potentially nefarious, but it does, I think it is a kind of plot device where you have just an exceedingly clever character that
Yeah.
kind of undoes the best plotting. And it's not that they are bad or anything like that. They're just too smart. And so they can see the holes in the story and ask the questions about, like, well, why are you saying it that way? Or you wouldn't
Yeah.
actually be in this hallway at this time. Like, why are you here? And so on. So it feels like one of those more than I suspect her of being a Black Aja.
Yeah, and I think that's where I'm kind of at, right? Is that Verin is such an interesting character because of all of the contradictions. She is the smiling, happy, distracted grandmother who also knows everything about every political plot in the entire kingdom. And like not knowing who Verin is my favorite thing about Verin. So, yay, we're playing the game correctly. I don't really have much to say about Fail actually getting along with Perrin. That was kind of the only moment I had for her. So unless you have anything to add to their relationship suddenly abruptly seeming like it's good, what do you have to say about Tam and Abel, our last two new characters in this chapter, who don't bring a lot other than rabbits, as far as I'm especially concerned?
A man was I thinking about Lord of the Rings with Gollum being so mad when Sam cooks the rabbits.
Yeah.
So I will only add to Fail to say that they've played this game a few times where it's very clear Fail understands dynamics and hospitality.
Yeah.
I had a professor who taught me the Odyssey and broke it all down how it's really a conduct manual, right? That if you act like a good guest in the Odyssey, then you survive whatever encounter you're on. And it's when you break the rules of hospitality. And so I thought it was really fun. And they've used this a few times, but they use it here in that moment you cited, where Fail understands the hospitality and the rules and the
Yeah.
kind of comportment, and Perrin just bumbles through. And it's a good dynamic. It's a good shtick. It makes me kind of chuckle every time it happens.
Yeah.
I wrote down one moment with Tam and Abel that I thought was really interesting, and that's when Perrin is getting particularly angry that the Aes Sedai have not taken action, right,
Uh-huh.
to They give a reason, but it doesn't satisfy him, and he's really angry that this situation in the Two Rivers has escalated as far as it has. And I really liked that kind of Tam and Abel warned him not to get too rageful, right? That they're
Yeah.
kind of shocked by how angry he gets. And I thought that was a good tip off. And then we get another hint next chapter, just about like, again, there is some wolfiness here, right? And
Yeah.
that maybe Perrin Perrin is changed. That could be the change of a man who's left his quiet village and gone out and seen some things and is changing.
Yeah.
Or it could be the change of becoming a wolf.
Yeah.
The eternal question: do we mature when we leave home, or is it just we become wolves? But I thought those were interesting plot points.
There are two wolves in you, and one of them is literally a wolf. I don't really have too much else to add here, right? I think this is the move the pieces around section of the chapter, and it does exactly what it needs to. The only other moment that I just really quickly wanted to call out is there's this really quick moment where the men give some advice to Perrin about how to handle women, and he realizes it is exactly the same advice that the women were giving Fael on how to handle men. And I think this is the first time we've been able to come full circle on the weird game Robert Jordan likes to play with gender dynamics, which is that he likes his men to draw a bunch of stereotypes about women, and he likes his women to draw a bunch of stereotypes against men, and then he likes to pull out the kind of like secret trick. Guess what? They're assuming exactly the same thing about each other, and they're both right. And I think that's all I have to say about this. It's just the first example we finally got of like everyone's a little bit sexist, but it turns out it's like even all around and everyone's sexist in the same way somehow.
Yes, I was like, oh, there's a culture analog in my head. What is it? What is it? What is that? That is what am I thinking of? And I realized, much to my chagrin, it's Babe, the movie about a pig.
Yep.
But there's a scene in that film where I forget it's like the dogs and the geese or something. It's two populations of animals, and the first one starts to speak, and the narrator says the goose will just say spoke slowly because it was clear that the other animals were known to be slow, and then the other character starts, and it's like the dog spoke slowly because it was known that geese needed and it's
Yeah.
exactly that dynamic, right? Of like, and it's a really kind of clever thing, and I guess it counts as a bit of dramatic irony for, the audience gets to see both sides. In this case,
Yeah.
Perrin does as well, but to get to see both sides of that, it's pretty good. I'll give you that one. Hold on, let me see his name again. Robert Jordan. Got it. Yeah,
Good
very good move, Mr.
good job
Jordan.
with pronunciation on the fly. That can be a challenging one. As we get into the Dane Bornhold section of this chapter, this is one of those chapters, or at least like sections, where I feel like what we're getting is just a bunch of reminders of how terrible the White Cloaks are, with occasional, but Dane Bornhold's not a bad one. Like that feels like 90% of this chapter, other than setting up Ordieth and his conflict with Dane Bornhold, right? There's not a whole lot else here in terms of plot. We're just reestablishing where everything is. This is one of the sections of the book where I often just say, like, what stuck out to you? Because if we just try to say what were the main points, I think we just redo my summary.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I have down in my notes is just to note if you wanted to think of the White Cloaks as unified, we're not there.
Yeah.
There's tension in their ranks as well, and that is primarily, like you said, Bornhold wanting to be separate from that. But it was clear that like he is a good man, but he is totally fixated
Yeah.
on Perrin and righting the wrongs committed against his father. So it feels to me like that is a very common and very dangerous stereotype, or not
Yeah.
archetype, not stereotype, where you have the righteous man with his misplaced righteous anger, right?
Mhm.
Like he is acting, lawful good, but the value is wrong. So
Yeah.
the what he's striving towards is not going to work. I found that really interesting. I was glad to see, in that regard, that he was having some friction with Ordieth, and we
Yeah.
get the suggestion that that he kind of covered up like the actual writing of that exchange, I had to read like 2 times because it was
Yeah.
like one guessing what the other would say, and I'm like, what is happening here? But it seemed to me to be that Ordieth had gone too far,
Yep.
and Bornhold had helped cover it up to protect Ordieth from the Lord Commander, and now was kind of regretting that because
Yeah.
when you let your fascist commander get away with one atrocity, it's a slippery slope.
If you give a mouse an atrocity. Yeah, I think you're nailing all of this. I think the thing that's really interesting to me about this section is how much, as you were describing the White Cloaks as not being kind of homogenous, not being a single group, what I found really interesting was pushing Dane Bornhald to see how far down the revenge and anger path we could take him and still have him think Ordieth was a step too far, right? That was the interesting game to be played here, is we're building a character who is clearly obsessed with Perrin in an unhealthy way, calling another character's obsession with Perrin unhealthy. And that's a difficult thing to believably do, I feel like, but it works here for me. I guess to some degree, what I'm saying is if you're going to make an evil person seem less evil, the easiest way to do it is to put him next to Padden Fane.
Well, and I will say I read the reference to the gray man in this part of the chapter. This is kind of undone, but my immediate impression was like, oh, Ordieth made them up. Like, right? It's like, oh, I just killed some gray men out of nowhere, and really assumed that to be true. And then in the next piece, the third piece of this chapter, it seems like they did exist
Yeah.
there. So it's a fun little game they're
The,
playing there as well.
Yeah, the impression that I got from that was something along the lines of if Ordieth is in some way working with the Shadow Spawn, he may have sent a gray man against himself so he could kill it and pretend the Shadow wanted to kill him. That was my guess at the plot. But you're right. It's very much like kind of like gestured at a lot and no one outright says anything.
It's what your parts of the internet call a false flag operation, right? That essentially Tylor is not QAnon. Let's just set that record straight in case his bosses come find this.
I'm more concerned about my
would
bosses finding this than I am about them thinking I'm QAnon. I just want to be clear. That's both not believable, and this is an extremely nerdy podcast.
So I'll just jump to the next piece. So how I took these two pieces together is we have this other figure that Perrin has taught us to call Stalker. We know that the Forsaken are essentially jockeying right now for who can be closest to the Dark One ultimately.
Yep.
And so I took this as there is somebody here to compete with Ordieth, with Padden Fane. And in being here and competing, that's where the Gray Men conflict may have come from. But the Murdral being tortured, I assume, is connected to Stalker, for lack of a better name for the other party
Slayer.
at this time. Slayer. Sorry, Slayer. Wow. Slayer. And so Padden Fane is at the moment most concerned about whoever is going to essentially come in and take over.
Yeah.
To speak to our one specific listener, right now, Padden Fane is Director Krennic, and Grand Moff Tarkin has arrived to take credit for the Death Star out of a la Rogue One, and take credit and get all the lauds from the Dark One. So that's a really interesting dynamic. Middle management squabbling inside of the White Cloaks. I'm here for it.
When you said our one specific listener, I knew you were either going to go Krennic or the Phantom Menace, and I had no idea until you actually went there. This is one of those places I feel like there's not much for me to say because I think this is kind of a breadcrumb section, right? It's designed to give you all of the pieces and not fully put it together, and so I can't put anything together for you. Chapter 32, questions to be asked. The next morning, Verin announces that they must leave quickly, worrying everyone because she apparently intends to go, which none of them realized. They then invite Alanna, knowing hopefully that she will not come along. She decides that she will not. And at this point, we get a couple of interesting notes. One, Fail immediately jumps into the conversation, saying something about her father, who apparently raised sheep, which Perrin points out is odd for a merchant, and she just ducks out of the conversation. Second, Loyal is told that he will be too noticeable until he is pulled aside from the Aes Sedai and told that in actuality, Perrin wants him to watch Alanna and see if she does anything suspicious. He seems a bit kind of uncomfortable with this idea at first, but eventually comes along to it. He agrees to do it. And then Verin kind of looks over all of his things, and in particular, she sees the hammer on his saddle pack and seems especially startled by it. At this point, there is a long discussion about horses. The entirety of my notes are horses. None of them are Bella. They ride in silence. Perrin realizes from the way that they are riding that Fail intends to protect him from the Aes Sedai, and he thinks this is somewhat absurd. And as they are kind of discussing as they ride, they have a discussion about why they're not kind of going more on the quiet roads, why they're not staying away from places they might be seen. And Perrin is told that all of the nearby farms are abandoned except the ones on the largest road, and they plan to go to the Alcine farm, which seems to be the only place where people actually are gathering in relatively large numbers. They say that they're going to arrive at Watch Hill relatively late, but Perrin notes that he doesn't need to worry about seeing in the dark. I take this as yet another sign that he is getting more and more wolfy. They discuss Trollocs and how many of them there are. They say maybe there are a few hundred, but they are partially held back by White Cloak patrols. Perrin realizes that there must be a reason that the Trollocs haven't attacked the two rivers, in particular Emond's Field, and that the White Cloaks are not there in large enough numbers to actually stop them. Tam and Abel say that this is probably just luck, but Fail argues that this is actually a sign that something else is going on. They must have a reason for not attacking. Once again, she starts to say something about her father, and then she clams up and doesn't say anything. At this point, Verin surmises that this must be a trap, and she says that it is probably Andor that they are trying to trap, but Perrin realizes the trap is much more likely to be for Rand. Eventually, they get to the Alcine farm, and the Aiel kind of leave and go off to hide so that they don't draw any notice. The Alcine farm is quite large, and there are a large number of boys on the roof who all have bows ready. They appear to be standing guard. The Alcines have taken in many kind of families and cousins and others, so they're an extremely large group, and there are all generations, including Layla, who Perrin thinks he has dreamed of once marrying, and you may recognize that name from a single episode of the television show. Fail is looking at Will, a good-looking person from the Two Rivers, and Perrin is clearly jealous, but tries to prove he's not jealous by talking to Will without being jealous, but Fail realizes that he was jealous and says, Perrin, Perrin, Perrin. At this point, they kind of have a number of people who are taken aback by Perrin's eyes, and then Jack Alcine, clearly the kind of head of the family, welcomes them, but advises them to go to a larger town. Verin clearly is implying the same thing that Moraine did, that she is here seeking stories, and Fail seems to be passing herself off as a noble, and Perrin seems very impressed at how well she's doing this. At this point, the Alcines basically raise questions about whether they should be helping Perrin. They all seem, one, to be worried about the White Cloaks, but two, also concerned about the associations that all three of the boys who ran off have with Aes Sedai. And they basically ask, why is it that the White Cloaks have labeled Perrin as a dark friend? Perrin says the White Cloaks don't need much reason, and he doesn't know why Rand and Mat have been accused, but he then admits that he killed the White Cloaks and says he did it in self-defense. Jack Alcine seems to accept this, and Verin suggests that the White Cloaks, what they are best at is splitting up communities. Perrin mentions Padden Fane and says that he is actually the dark friend, and when Jack Alcine seems unconvinced, his wife actually steps in and stands up for Perrin, saying that they are going to let him stay. They begin to have a meal when the children become getting excited and shouting for Lord Luke, who presumably will be the new weave in the pattern that we meet in the next chapter. Greg, that was a lot to say about a very brief chapter. what stood out to you here? Because a lot of this chapter could be described as Perrin rode his horse to a farm and then didn't get kicked out.
Yeah, I have very little in my notes for this chapter, so I'll just focus on kind of a big comment, which is, I think I don't read a lot of fantasy books, as we've established, but I think sci-fi gets a lot of credit for doing allegory that talks to our current world and our moment and so on, and fantasy doesn't seem to
Mhm.
get as much credit in that regard. And I will say I thought this chapter was a pretty good picture of what it's like to be a controlled territory, right? Which
Mhm.
it's not specifically any piece of world history. It's all pieces of world history in that it's kind of generic enough, but this idea that power and control is based on division and surveillance and getting the divided to surveil each other. This all comes back to the theorist Michel Foucault and Discipline and Punishment, which is his landmark work that established a lot of those themes and the way they function in the modern state. And I felt like this was a pretty subtle way to kind of tell you all that. I mean, yes, the character does just say it, so it's not all that subtle, but I really liked it, right? Like it's a presentation of a controlled territory, and it shows what drivers fear and suspicion can be, and that is both of each other and of the powerful, right?
Yep.
My dissertation advisor always said power used to be that monarchs let you live and then made you die, and then the nation state became making you live and letting you die, and this is somewhere in between those dichotomies
Yep.
in this really interesting way that helps us kind of picture what this is like for this quiet agrarian community that is now kind of in the middle of this really chaotic situation. All that is to say, I have no notes on specific events. It's like that was kind of to me the point of all this, is to just show those dynamics playing out. I didn't find anybody on the farm particularly compelling or memorable. It seemed to me, let's just remind us all there's lots of skeptical townsfolk around. There's lots of mistrust and strife within the group, outside of the group. It's just all suspicion all the way down. And hey, Luke's coming next chapter.
I think my favorite thing about doing this podcast is when you say things about Michel Foucault and like biopolitics and whether we are allowed to live or allowed to die. And then I follow up with like, and wasn't it interesting when Verin looked at the hammer and Perrin thought she was really surprised by it? Like, that's all I've got in this chapter. You've got big, big themes. I've got itty bitty tiny moments, right? There's not a ton here. The one that kind of directly ties into what you were saying is I thought the most interesting piece of, if we're thinking of this as a story about, power and desperation and how do you get by in a place that's, under conflict from multiple sides, the story of you get so caught up in what is happening that you forget to ask why it's happening rang really true, right? The fact that Ham and Abel or Abel, however you pronounce it, the fact that they're considered basically the smartest people in town, right? They are not the mayor, but they are the most prominent members of the men's circle. They, clearly are, they're considered the wisest people in town, and they were willing to accept, well, they didn't do it, so it must have just been good luck as a good enough reason, right? And I think what happens sometimes in situations like this is you just get so worn down by dealing with the next crisis and the next crisis and the next crisis that you start to miss all of the gaps in the, breaks in logic that allow these kind of regimes to work, despite the fact that they say don't have enough weight cloaks to actually fight off all of the Trollocs, hypothetically, right? I think that just rang really true to me in the way that you're describing this being a chapter about like getting people to doubt their friends. It's also a chapter about getting people to doubt their instincts when it comes to why and when things are happening.
I like that a lot, right? And that's what control is, and that is Foucault, right? When the power apparatus can move from an external set of factors to an internalized set of
Yeah.
suspicions, then true control is achieved. And That's what we all live under. Just to make sure we get really dark,
Yeah.
right? And that's not a slam on the U.S. government or anything specific to our country. It's just how power operates today. Fill in your powerful institution you don't like, and it works that way. So, um, and then I'll just, I mean, maybe you have more specific things to say, but I will say, the most intriguing thing to me here is the cliffhanger, because we just got a pretty good picture of what things look like in the White Cloaks at the end of last chapter.
Yeah.
And then we get Lord Luke coming, who we have heard of before as am I correct in remembering somebody resisting the White Cloaks in
Yes.
some kind of way?
Yeah, that's correct. So when we were talking to the mayor and his wife a couple of chapters ago, they mentioned Luke as being one of the few people who had advocated for kind of the Two Rivers kind of standing for itself rather than relying on the White Cloaks. Um, two,
And we know, oh, go ahead.
please, no, yours is more important.
Finishing the Lord Luke thought, and then jump back to what small details you want us to remember. Um, we know that Lord Luke is not of the Two Rivers, right?
Correct.
He's not like somebody they were fans of. So I will put my pin in. We just learned there is some dangerous person named Slayer out there and is challenging Ordeath. And what better way to challenge Ordeath than to rise up and help the small number of White Cloaks be there? So that's where I'm putting my prediction stamp for next week. But you have some details to fill in before we say those other words.
Just two really small things. First off, I mentioned this multiple times in my kind of preview of this chapter, but Fail has some odd moments. She brings up her father multiple times and then immediately is like, nope, nope, not going to say anything about my father. She gets contradicted at one point. She says her father raises sheep, despite the fact that she had previously said he was a merchant, and those two things usually don't go together. And Perrin, multiple times in this chapter, is really impressed by her decorum. You talked about this in the last chapter of kind of her ability to fit in with the Aes Sedai. All of the people in the Two Rivers just immediately assume that she is a noble. And so I'm now starting to have real questions about like who is Aaron or who is Fail's father? What was she running away from? Because we know that she left home at some point. Like, I'm just very curious about who Fail is, because for the first time, I think I'm now really doubting whether she is exactly who she's told Perrin she is. Any thoughts on that?
I took it less as she lied about who she is, as in more there's a depth we haven't uncovered. And
Okay.
that might be a subtle distinction, but I would say what I'm trying to denote is that it's a lie of omission, not a lie.
Yeah.
And that matters slightly, but you call both things a lie. So
Speaking of a lie of omission, but not a lie, it turns out that Verin and Moraine have the same one. They go to places and say they are looking for old stories, when what they mean is they are looking for those old stories brought back to life through a cycle of reincarnation. Any thoughts? I just know this was a line that you had latched onto when Moraine said it like 3.5 books ago. What do you think now that you are seeing it in light of the Three Oaths, in light of how do you tell a truth without giving away your full plan? It's a phrase that has a very different meaning when Verin says it than when Moraine did.
Oh, I certainly liked its return. I'm glad you pulled that out to remind me. I did smile when she said that again, and it's the same phrase with a completely different valence now. And I think you just said it, which is they are literally looking for the figures of legend, not like legends of past figures. And that's pretty cool and pretty fun. I do think it matters. I read it more as they are still aligned in some way, more than this is like just a standard Aes Sedai cover story. Like,
Yeah.
oh, everybody uses this old chestnut. I took that to mean, again, somewhere deep down, Verin and Moraine are still together, even if that is hope
Yeah.
predicting, as the case may be.
I like hope dicting. I'm in on that phrase. I have nothing else here. I think we've covered the big stuff. I always think it's fun to just get big piles of people from the Two Rivers, because then we could just see kind of what cliches of the country folk turn out to be true in Randland, which is always a good time. But there's no big stuff to do in the second half of this chapter. I think it's setting up for, as you say, Lord Luke is coming, and now we have people to react to Lord Luke coming. Greg, how are you feeling about the place that we're at? Because I'm pretty sure we just hit the 50% mark in this book. Why don't you take us out of this episode with a celebration of being halfway through, despite the fact that, man, this is a long ass book.
Yeah, I mean, I flipped into my book a second ago. I was like, oh shoot, I forgot in the opening to mention that this is the halfway point, which is just crazy. We got a good piece past it. We were just shy of the halfway point in my paperback, at least last time. So I'm feeling pretty good. I think this mystery of who Lord Luke is intriguing. And I will say part of that is the fact that next week will be a one chapter week, but that chapter is called A New Weave in the Pattern. And my immediate reaction to that was like, okay, so this is another one of those things that is unexpected, right? That there's kind of the normal flow of the story and some quirk has occurred and we're going to see it flow in a different direction. We'll see if that's correct. We'll see if that's not correct. But I'm feeling pretty good as we move halfway through this book. You know, when we were talking in December back, as we were preparing to do this, and for listeners in the future, we are recording this now in early April. It felt like crazy when you said it would last us until August, but now here we are, roughly halfway in the fourth month of the year. So it certainly is moving quickly, and it's been fun to have kind of this anticipation as we lead into this part of the spring. We're like a week ahead of you, listeners who listen the day this drops. So to really think about where this is going to go in this kind of moment where we're crazy academics and we think everybody stops working in early May and that's their summer because that's the privileged lifestyle we live. But it feels like we're headed into some really fun chapters right when I get to have a little more free time to luxuriate with them. So we're glad you're here, dear listener. We're glad for all the feedback we continue to get and people who reach out. And we hope you're enjoying this journey as much as we are. And if not, then don't come back next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.